There are a lot of choices that we make from time to time, day to day. Some choices we make occasionally. Sometimes we might go a long time between having to make a choice about this or that or something else. But some choices come to us every single day. And the challenge for those of us who want to be pleasing to God is make choices that comply with His will, with His instructions. That involves all aspects of our lives. A lot of people have the mistaken notion that serving God is just what you do when you come together in a worship assembly such as this. Obviously that's important, and we want to conduct our worship assembly. We want to make the decisions about the things we do together in our assemblies in compliance with the Word of God. But many decisions are on the day-to-day, everyday basis. And we want to talk about one of those tonight. We want to talk about the clothes that we wear and the choices that we make about the clothes that we wear. There are a lot of things that are unique about our association together in the congregation here at College View. And one of them is, there's a lot of things, a lot of good things about our association together at College View. One of them is rather unique, and that is in that there's an expectation of me that I would preach on such themes on a regular basis. There's a lot of places where people do not want you talking about clothes, about modesty. Obviously, that's the gist of our message tonight. And in fact, people get upset if you do talk about that. But here, on the other hand, there's actually an expectation, and it's sort of like I've let down on my responsibilities if I don't teach about this with some regularity. In fact, even tonight, this lesson that I'm going to talk about tonight is one that I was asked to teach about. This is a lesson that I preached a number of years ago here at College View, and someone said, I want you to get that lesson out. I'd like you to preach that again. And so that's unique. I think that's unique. I think that's a good thing that we have going for us here at College View, that we care for even that sort of thing that a lot of places don't even want to hear about. I know that there are churches and preachers who would say, that's just not something I think we're going to cover. Maybe too controversial. People don't want to hear it. But again, here it is requested, and so I appreciate that very much. We thank you all for being here tonight. It's been a good day here in Middle Tennessee, and we've had privilege, many of us, to be together with family, which is a blessing for sure. And as James prayed just a moment ago, now we have an opportunity to be together with our spiritual family again as the day draws to an end. And we appreciate you all for being with us tonight, and special thanks to those who are visiting. All right, we're not plowing new ground tonight. We're dealing with some information that we've talked about plenty of times before. As I said, there's always been an expectation that I would cover such material, and I only know so many ways to say the same thing over and over again, and so there's a lot of repeat here, and you all know the arguments, but it's good to be reminded. And the first reminder that we want to make is that nakedness is a shame. Just very simply, to expose your nakedness is a shameful thing. It's always been so. We're going to see in a moment that it was true way back in the beginning in the reading that Ethan did for us earlier. Way back in the beginning in the Garden of Eden, nakedness was a shame, but it has always been so. Very much later in the Scriptures, we read a reference to that. I believe it continues to be true even today. Look at this statement in the book of Revelation. In Revelation chapter 3, as the Lord was addressing that lukewarm church at Laodicea, He said, I counsel thee to buy of me gold tried in the fire, that thou mayest be rich, and white raiment, that thou mayest be clothed, that, notice, the shame of thy nakedness do not appear, and anoint thine eyes with eye salve, that thou mayest see. Notice, there was a shame associated with nakedness. Now, we understand that here, this is a spiritual statement, right? This was talking about the spiritual condition of the church at Laodicea. And they were shamefully naked in a spiritual sense. But I think we can still draw a conclusion from this. The Lord is using that notion and making a spiritual application of it. But the spiritual application can only be true based upon the physical reality of the fact that nakedness is a shame. So nakedness is a shame. And the Lord is saying to this church, you're spiritually naked, and that's a shameful thing. So you see how that's used there. You couldn't even make that point, of course, unless it was factually true that nakedness is a shame. Later in Revelation chapter 16, verse 15, behold, as I come as a thief, blessed is he that watcheth and keepeth his garment, lest he walk naked, and they see his shame. Again, this is also a spiritual statement. We're aware of that. But I just make the point to you once again, you couldn't make a spiritual parallel to something that wasn't true physically, and thus the Lord here has made that connection. And so there is a shame associated with nakedness. Now, since that's true, what we ought to really be interested is in knowing what the definition of nakedness is. And the Bible does define it. Now, nakedness is not, biblically, when we use that word naked, it is not equivalent to totally without a stitch of clothing on. That's not the way the word is used. The word naked is used in regards to that which is insufficient clothing, that which does not cover the body adequately, that which exposes parts of the body that should not be exposed. And so please understand that this is not talking about someone who's walking around completely nude when it talks about someone who's naked. This is just talking about someone who's not adequately covered, doesn't have enough clothes on. Parts of the body are showing that should not be shown. And by the way, and I think we'll be able to demonstrate, the parts of the body that should not be shown, that's more than just the so-called private parts of the body. Certainly the private parts of the body ought to be covered. And if they're not, that's nakedness. But we'll see from the Scriptures, as the Scriptures define this for us, that nakedness requires covering more of the body. If you're going to cover your nakedness, you're going to cover more than just the private parts of the body. So where would we get some help in attaining this definition from the Bible? Well, go back with me to the reading that we read in Genesis chapter 3, and we're going to find out that covering nakedness requires covering the torso of the body for sure. And the reason why we know that is because of what happened in the Garden of Eden. In Genesis chapter 3, beginning verse 6 or 7, notice it says, they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons. So after Adam and Eve had eaten of the forbidden fruit, they knew that they were naked. Okay, there's our word. That's what we want to know about, right? So what was the situation with them? Well, obviously, initially they didn't have any clothes on at all, none whatsoever. But they got busy and used fig leaves and made themselves aprons. And so Adam and Eve initially made aprons that effectively just covered the private parts of their body. The Zondervan Pictorial Encyclopedia of the Bible says that the word apron means a, quote, this is a quote, brief covering material for the lower front of the body which ties around the waist. Okay, picture that now. That's pretty straightforward, isn't it? Brief covering material for the lower front of the body which ties around the waist. So if that's the case, then these aprons that Adam and Eve made for themselves just basically covered their private parts, right? All right. As we keep reading there, when God came into the garden seeking Adam and Eve, He called out, and Adam answered. And Adam said, I was afraid because I was naked and I hid myself. Now, wait a minute. He had already made these aprons, right? He had already made the aprons. He had that very restricted part of his body covered. But when the Lord came into the garden, He still hid Himself because He felt He was naked, even after just covering the private parts of His body. Apparently, God agreed with that assessment. God asked, Who told thee that thou wast naked? How did you know that? And of course, this exposes the fact that they had eaten of the forbidden fruit, the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so I want you to make this progression. They were naked. They made aprons that just covered the very bare minimum of their private areas of their body. But when the Lord came in the garden seeking them, they hid because they still felt naked. And apparently the Lord agreed. Who told you that you were naked? That you're still naked? You were naked before, and even after you put these aprons on, you're still naked. And when you skip down to verse 21, the context says, unto Adam also and to his wife did the Lord make coats of skins and clothed them. They finally got clothed when the Lord made them coats of skins. The International Standard Bible Encyclopedia says that the word coat there means, and here the coats mean, quote, corresponding most nearly to our long shirt, reaching below the knees always. And so the Lord made something for them that covered lots more than just the private parts of their body. The Lord made them coats that covered them from neck down to below the knees at least. It corresponds most closely to our long shirt, reaching below the knees always, is what the authority says that word means. And so, if you take that information, now that's just very basic information right from the very beginning of time. You take that basic information, you get the idea that nakedness would be defined as exposing the torso of your body, right? Not just the private parts, but also the torso of the body. And then we could go further to say that exposing nakedness involves showing the leg above the knee. So if you talk about exposing the body, the torso of the body, first of all, let's just talk about exposing the torso of the body. If that's true, I don't know any reason why we would argue that's not true, then that would argue against, obviously, going topless, right? Well, even in our society, it's still a shocking thing if a woman goes topless. But somehow or another, it's imagined that it's okay for a man to go around without his shirt on. Whoever imagined that? The Lord made for both the man and the woman these coats of skins to clothe them. And so, for men or women alike, to show the torso of their body, to go topless would be wrong. Or for that matter, that which exposes parts of the torso. And obviously, then you got to talk about low-cut tops. You got to talk about loose, sleeveless tops and dresses. You got to talk about things that allow for parts of the upper torso of the body to be exposed, for men or for women. I just ask a question. For instance, concerning a woman's breast, how much can you see without it being nakedness? What's your judgment? And then let me ask you, on what basis would you make that judgment? Oh, somebody said, oh, surely a woman could expose 10% of her upper body. Really? Okay, you say 10%. The next guy says 25%. Somebody says, oh, I think you could see half of a woman's breast without it really being nakedness. On what basis are you going to make that judgment? You're not going to make that on any biblical basis, right? From a biblical perspective, when God made those coats, it covered them from the neck down to below their knees. That's pretty straightforward. And if you're going to suggest that you can show some element of the upper torso of the body, man or woman, you're going to have to justify that from some sort of biblical reasoning, and I don't know where you would find that. Now, there's more that can be said about it. We're not going to cover all the arguments in regards to the torso of the body, but exposing the torso of the body is clearly an exposure of nakedness that the Lord does not want. Now, I think this is also important, showing the leg above the knee. What about that? And how would we would we determine that this also is an element of nakedness? Well, we're going to go to the Old Testament again, and here we're going to read from the Law of Moses. Now, usually when we make this argument, you've heard this argument before. Someone says, oh yeah, well, you're saying that Christians have to dress like the Old Testament priest, the Levitical priest. No, we're not saying that. We're not saying that at all. We're just going to an Old Testament text to try and grasp a part of the definition that God has for this subject of nakedness. We're not saying that you have to dress in priestly garments, anything like that. We're just trying to grab a definition here. God's defining terms for us. All right? So here, read this. This was about the clothes that the priest wore. Exodus 28, beginning verse 40. And for Aaron's sons thou shalt make coats, and thou shalt make them and you shall make for them girdles, and bonnets shalt thou make for them for glory and for beauty. And thou shalt put them on Aaron thy brother, and his sons with him. And thou shalt make them linen breeches to cover their nakedness. From the loins even unto the thighs shall they reach, and they shall be upon Aaron and upon his sons when they come into the tabernacle of the congregation, or when they come near unto the altar to minister in the holy place. Make them linen breeches to cover their nakedness. From the loins even unto the thighs they shall reach. All right, here's an interesting definition of terms, right? Now, by the way, I want to point out to you that this was actually specifying what we would call the underwear of the priests. This was not normally exposed. This was something they wore under their garments, so that if in the course of their work, and the work of the priest was sometimes quite heavy and strenuous as they went about making sacrifices and lifting carcasses of animals upon the altar and so forth. So under their priestly robes, they would wear these linen breeches just in case someone might see up under their garments, so that their nakedness would not be exposed. All right? That's what these were for, exclusively. They were not for display. It wasn't like the priests were going about doing their work in Bermuda shorts. They were not. They were wearing their long priestly robes, and this was their underwear, just in case someone might see under their robes and view their nakedness. This was specifically to cover the nakedness of the lower body, particularly the legs, the thigh of the legs. This expression, from the loins even unto the thighs, quite a bit has been written about that, and I can share some of that with you if you desire to have that information later. But there's no doubt that this is describing something that went from the waist to the knees, covering both extremes. The word loins talks about that private area of the body. Obviously, you know what the thigh is. The thigh extends to the knee on the leg. And so this covered the loins and the thighs. If it didn't, that expression wouldn't even describe any area whatsoever. If it didn't include both the loins and the thighs, then it doesn't cover anything. So this covered both the loins and the thighs. All right, so there's another important part of our definition of nakedness. Nakedness involves showing the torso of the body and showing the leg above the knee. Now, I think we have to stress that last requirement we talked about applies not only when we're standing, but also when we're sitting, when we bend over, when we get into a car or get out of a car and so forth. This requirement would be all the time, right? This is not saying that you've got to cover the thigh of your leg. You've got to cover the leg at least down to the knee when you're standing perfectly straight upright, at attention. Your garment needs to come to at least the middle of the knee when you're standing at attention. Nowhere does it say that. And so if I'm exposing nakedness when I show the thigh of my leg, if that happens when I sit down, I'm okay when I'm standing up. But if when I sit down, what I'm wearing rides up and exposes my thigh, I've exposed my nakedness while I'm sitting. If I bend over, when I stoop down to get into a car, if the garment I'm wearing rides up in such fashion that the thigh of my leg is shown, I've exposed my nakedness. I want you to think about that. Young people especially think about this. All of us need to think about this. So what about a girl's dress or skirt? It comes, man, I mean, it's within a hair's breadth, but it's there. It's sort of at the middle of the knee. The thigh is covered when she's standing up. What happens when she sits down? Unless it's a really full skirt, it's going to come up. You're going to see, maybe, if it's a tight skirt, you're going to see half of her thigh or more when she sits down, right? What's going to happen to you when you're wearing shorts? Well, if your shorts come to your knee, when you sit down, your shorts are going to be halfway up your thigh. And so you're going to be exposing your nakedness. Now that's just plain simple observation. There's no science to that whatsoever. You know that. You have seen that. If you wear shorts or short skirts, you have experienced that. Now that's just the way it is. I mean, that's not me talking. That's just facts of the matter, okay? That's just the way it is, and it's clear that God wants us to keep our thighs covered. You can't adequately do that with typical shorts and short skirts. It just simply doesn't happen. All right, I'm ready to draw lines. I'm ready to draw some lines on this picture up here. How often have you heard it said that when it comes to modest dress, you can't draw any lines? No, you can't draw any lines. We're just going to have to leave that open and ambiguous, and everybody's going to have to make their own determinations about these questions of modesty. And specifically, people, even Christians, sometimes get quite agitated if you say that there are certain lines. I'll tell you, I believe there are lines. I think I can draw some lines. And if I'm drawing lines, I'm drawing them like that on these stick figures up here. Right? Because we already said that we need to cover the torso of the body and we need to cover the leg above the knee. And so there's my lines, but they're actually not my lines. I think those are biblical lines. That's where the lines, I think, are drawn, right? Well, what would you say if someone said, I think that you can take that line up there about like that, just above the knee, just a couple inches above the knee. I think there are even some educational institutions that some of our brethren frequent and support that say, yeah, well, your shorts have to be no more than 2 inches above your knee. Really? Now where are you going to go? What Bible are you going to use to support that deduction? 2 inches above the knee is the thigh, right? And if you're wearing your shorts or your skirts 2 inches above the knee, when you sit down, you're showing way more than that, right? A lot of people say, well, I think that'd be all right, a couple inches above the knee. Really? I mean, where's your basis? How are you going to justify that decision? Someone says, well, I think I could go that high, right? Oh, somebody, oh, come on now, that's getting too short. That's too short for me. I couldn't go with that. I couldn't agree with that conclusion. Well, actually, if you're wearing short, tight skirts or typical shorts, I'll tell you, when you sit down, you're exposing that much of your thigh. It's just reality. You can argue with that if you want to, but that's what happens. That's just not me saying that. That's the way clothes work. You sit down with typical shorts, even if your shorts come to your knee or nearly to your knee. When you sit down, you're now at this line. And I don't think there's very many people who would here, at least, there are people in the world obviously, but there are not very many people here who would be comfortable if while you're standing, you were showing that much of your leg. A lot of people would not be comfortable with that, but that's what happens when you sit down. I've seen it. You have as well. And so, again, where are you going to draw your line? I think the Bible's drawn a line for us. It's from the neck to below the knee, always. That's what those coats were that God made in the Garden of Eden. We've got a biblical basis for making that determination. We know that the priests were supposed to have those linen breeches on that covered to their knee, even when they were busy about their work on the altar. If you're going to draw your line someplace else, you got to justify that. And you're going to have to justify that before the Lord, because I'm not the one who's going to judge you about that. Nobody else is either. But the Lord is the one who will make that final judgment. And again, what about the upper body? What about this woman who says, I think I can show 10% of my breast without violating the limitations of nakedness? Well, another says, I believe I can show 50% of my breast without being naked. How are you going to do that? How are you going to justify those? Remember, it's all about choices. You're making choices. You choose the clothes you buy and wear. How are you going to make that choice? All right. Quickly, let me suggest to you that as Christians, the instruction for us is to adorn ourselves in modest apparel with shamefacedness and sobriety. We're going to go to that text here in 1 Timothy. We're going to go to that text in 1 Timothy chapter 2 in a minute. But the standard for Christians is more than just avoiding nakedness. Everything that we have said so far just goes to this nakedness question. But for the Christian who wants to be pleasing to God and a proper example in the world, being right is way more than just merely avoiding nakedness. We're not going to try to see the limits that we can push. We're not going to see how we can, get as close to sin as we possibly can without sinning. That's an entirely wrong attitude in the first place. We are not going to push those limits. And adorning ourselves in modest apparel with shamefacedness and sobriety is way more than just avoiding nakedness. Look at our text here. And this should be 1 Timothy. This chart's wrong. I corrected it on my notes, but I didn't correct it here. In 1 Timothy 2, verse 9, Paul says, let them adorn themselves in modest apparel with shamefacedness and sobriety. Notice the word adorn here. Kenneth Woost in his word study says that this means to put in order, arrange, make ready. The apparel must be congruous with, fitting to, and consistent with what she is, a child of God. Do you get that? I especially think this last part is very clear. The way you dress must be consistent with what you are, a child of God. And so to adorn means to put in order. And that orderliness is not just that the colors match, or that the patterns match. My mom always would pitch a fit if you had plaids and stripes together in the clothes that you wear. You can't wear plaids and stripes together. That doesn't go together. Okay, that doesn't go together. So go back and change. Get rid of one or the other. But this is not talking about whether the patterns or colors of your clothes are arranged and in order. This is talking about whether or not the clothes you're wearing fit what you claim to be. You claim to be a Christian, and your clothes need to fit that. They need to be arranged in such a way as it demonstrates that you are a Christian. The word out of this passage that we use more than any others, this word modest, and it's probably the least descriptive word in the text. It's still an important word. Vine says that the word modest means orderly, well-arranged, and decent. There's the word probably we would concentrate on. It needs to be decent. The fact of the matter is that many of the fashions and trends in the world today are just not decent. You know that. Certainly we've got to avoid anything indecent. We need to be modest, decent in the clothes that we wear. I think a key word is this word shamefacedness. Again, Kenneth Woost says that shamefacedness is a respectful timidity and a humility. I know you recognize this full well. Some of the fashions in the world today are just, the expression we use, they are in your face, right? Some people are just trying to see how outrageously immodest they can be. They're just trying to see how much of their physical body they can put on public display. They are in your face with their immodesty. as Christians, that shouldn't characterize us at all. As Christians, there should be a respectful timidity. We're not that sort of people. We do not want to put our bodies on display. We need to be respectfully timid and humble. I think that's a really important expression. And again, our point with this is that the standard for us as Christians is way more than just don't show your nakedness. Obviously, we can't show our nakedness. But actually, this is a way higher bar, isn't it? We're not even trying to see how close we can get to nakedness. We want to keep our bodies covered. We have a respectful timidity. The word sobriety. Trench, in his word study, says that the word sobriety here means the habitual inner self-government with its constant rein on all the passions and desires. Notice, self-government. You govern yourself. This is self-control versus letting myself and my clothes choices be governed by what the world is doing. You know, a lot of people do that. Whatever the trend is, that's the way they got to dress. And unfortunately, a lot of times people dress according to the current fashion trends, and it really, even from just a this world perspective, makes them look awful, right? You see some girl at Walmart and you see the horribly immodest clothes that she has on, but she's doing it, and it even makes her look bad. She can't pull it off. This kind of clothes don't look good on her. She shouldn't dress that way. She'd look a lot better if she covered herself up. She'd look fine if she was covered. She looks awful because she's exposing her. But the reason why she's doing it is because that's what society dictates. That's what the fashion trends call for. So she's not governing herself. She's letting the world govern her, right? For us, if we are going to be sober in regards to this clothing question, then we are self-governing, self-controlling. We're keeping a rein on our passions and desires. And so I would suggest to you, all of this is important consideration. I don't doubt that at all. But for Christians, this actually shouldn't even have to be discussed about covering nakedness, because we should want to go well beyond that. We shouldn't even be trying to push those limits, you see. Our standard is much higher. And then finally, just a quick observation. I think modesty includes the notion of dressing appropriately. So we were saying, you got to do more than just cover your nakedness. Your status as a Christian would dictate that you should certainly dress well beyond just covering nakedness. But I think that this whole notion of what's decent and well arranged has to do with appropriateness as well. Years ago, I was dumbfounded. We had a lady, a faithful Christian in the local congregation who just never missed services. She was just very faithful in all she did. But she had one only son, and he never attended services. He was not a Christian. She passed, and we went to her funeral. And at her funeral, her one and only son had on a Dale Earnhardt NASCAR racing t-shirt at his mother's funeral. It just struck me as just crazily inappropriate. You're not respecting the occasion. It's not appropriate to what we're doing in that regard, and so forth. There are occasions that deserve more consideration in regards to what is appropriate. Modesty would even suggest that which is appropriate. Jesus taught a parable. In Matthew 22, beginning verse 2, the kingdom of heaven is likened to a certain king which made a marriage for his son. And you remember a part of that parable goes on to say, when the king came in to see the guest, he saw a man which had not on a wedding garment. And he said unto him, Friend, how camest thou in hither, not having a wedding garment? And he was speechless. And then the king Then said the king to the servants, Bind him hand and foot and take him away and cast him into outer darkness. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. In that parable Jesus was teaching, he said, this is just not appropriate. Why are you here and you're not dressed appropriately? And the man was cast out of the wedding feast. I understand that's a parable, But I'd like to make an application of that to our worship assemblies. You know full well that there's a trend in our society that even bleeds over into our assemblies, and that's the idea of sort of casualness and contemporariness in our religious world. And so you see people dressing down when it comes to the worship assemblies. Now, we're not dictating or certainly not enforcing a dress code relative to the times when we come together for worship. But I would just point out that modesty in its fullest sense does suggest that there are things that are appropriate. Not that modesty is an appropriateness of dress, not just covering the elements of our body, we've talked about all that, but just that we dress appropriate to the occasion. You know, there's dress that is appropriate to when I'm out mowing the grass. I got to mow my grass tomorrow, man. William, you may want to bring the hay baler over. I mean, there may be some hay to bale there when I get that grass mowed down. So I'm going to go out and I'm going to mow my grass. I'm not going to be wearing what I'm wearing right now when I go out to mow the grass. There's clothing that's appropriate for that kind of activity. There's clothing that's appropriate for this kind of activity. And I think that in the view of modesty, that's to be taken into consideration as well. All right, that's our lesson for you. It's not new. In fact, very specifically, that's an old lesson that somebody asked me to dig out and preach again. But I hope you agree that there are important principles there that we all need to pay attention to. Thanks for your careful attention to what we've had to say. We're going to sing a song of invitation. As we sing this song, we'll be asking everybody, think about your relationship with God and make sure it's right. If we can help in that in any way, please let us know while we stand and sing this song.
Bring Christ your broken life.